Have you ever wondered why the Bible gives us so much detail about Abraham's life, yet stays almost silent about the other women connected to him besides Sarah and Hagar? In the book of Genesis, we follow Abraham's journey closely, his call from God in Genesis 12, the covenant promises in Genesis 15 and 17, the dramatic stories with Pharaoh, Lot, and the angels of Sodom. We learn about Sarah's struggle with barrenness and the birth of Isaac in Genesis 21. We even hear about Hagar, the Egyptian servant who gives birth to Ishmael in Genesis 16 and who later cries out to God in the wilderness when she's sent away in Genesis 21. But then, almost suddenly and quietly, Genesis 25:1 says, Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. Just like that. No build-up, no context, no origin story. It's as if the Bible introduces her in passing, expecting us not to ask too many questions. But if we pause there, really pause, we begin to see something unusual. Keturah is named, which in biblical tradition often signals importance. And not only is she named, but her children are listed: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah. That's 6 sons, 6 nations. These are not minor details. They are hints. And what makes this even more mysterious is that later in Genesis 25:5-6, it says Abraham gave everything he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living and sent them away eastward. The fact that these sons are sent away, not included in the main inheritance, mirrors what happened to Ishmael. But these sons are not just strangers. They are also Abraham's children. So who was their mother really? And why did her story fade into the background while Sarah and Hagar remain center stage? Some Jewish teachings suggest that Keturah was actually Hagar, returned to Abraham after Sarah's death. The idea comes from her name. Keturah is related to the Hebrew word for incense, and tradition says she remained faithful and pure, like a sweet offering, even after being cast out. If this theory is true, then it changes everything. It would mean that the woman once rejected came back into Abraham's life and helped fulfill his destiny to become the father of many nations, Genesis 17:4. It would be a story of restoration, mercy, and hidden fulfillment. But other scholars argue that Keturah was a completely separate woman. Maybe she was from a noble family or a distant tribe. Maybe she was young when Abraham, now old and widowed, took her as a wife. Either way, her sons would go on to become ancestors of powerful people. One of them, Midian, became the father of the Midianites, an important group in the Bible. Moses would later marry a Midianite woman named Zipporah, Exodus 2:21. And her father, Jethro, would help Moses lead and organize the people, Exodus 18. So even after Abraham's death, the legacy of Keturah's children remained close to the heart of Israel's story. Why then is there such little attention given to her? It could be that the writers of Genesis wanted to focus the story around the covenant God made with Isaac. By narrowing the spotlight, the story stays centered on the chosen line that leads to Israel. But that doesn't mean the other people didn't matter. In fact, Genesis 25:6 clearly shows that Abraham acknowledged these sons and gave them gifts, just not the main inheritance. This act shows a father who knew his children had purpose, even if they weren't part of the central promise. It also reminds us that God's blessings are wide, even when his covenant is specific. The Bible often works this way, focused on one thread while other important stories continue just outside the spotlight. Keturah's story seems to be one of those. Her sons don't disappear. They become nations, traders, neighbors, and even sometimes enemies of Israel. The Midianites, for example, helped Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, Genesis 37:28. Later, they are both allies and threats to the Israelites. Their presence is constant, even if the Bible doesn't always point directly back to their origin, and that origin, quietly but clearly, leads back to Keturah. The Bible says Abraham lived 175 years and died satisfied, Genesis 25:7-8. He was buried by Isaac and Ishmael, two sons from two different women. But what about Keturah and her sons? There's no mention of them at the burial, no mention of her reaction, no recorded grief, no songs, no stories, just the echo of her name and the list of sons who were sent away. Yet even in their absence from the main narrative, their influence lives on. What if the silence surrounding Keturah is not an accident, but an invitation to look closer, to ask harder questions, to wonder what other voices were left out? Because if the descendants of Keturah were influential, and if her children interacted with God's people in major ways, then her place in Abraham's life wasn't just a side note, it was part of the foundation. And maybe, just maybe, the legacy of faith is bigger than what we've been taught to see. Maybe the promises of God flowed through more than just one line. Maybe the unseen wife was never unseen by God. If Keturah was actually Hagar returning under a new name, as some ancient Jewish traditions suggest, then the story of Abraham's family becomes even more layered, emotional, and meaningful. We know from Genesis 16 that Hagar was Sarah's Egyptian servant. When Sarah couldn't conceive, she gave Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate, a decision that quickly led to tension. After Hagar became pregnant, Sarah grew jealous, and Hagar fled into the wilderness. There, in Genesis 16:7-13, something remarkable happened. An angel of the Lord found her by a spring and told her to return, giving her a promise. Her son would be named Ishmael, and he would become the father of a great nation. Hagar then called God El Roi, the God who sees me. She was the first person in the Bible to give God a name based on personal experience. This tells us something powerful about her. She was not just a servant, she was seen. Later in Genesis 21, after Sarah finally gave birth to Isaac, the family tension returned. Sarah told Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, fearing that Ishmael might share in Isaac's inheritance. Abraham was distressed, but God told him to listen to Sarah, assuring him that Ishmael would also become a great nation. Genesis 21:12-13. So Abraham gave Hagar some bread and water, and she and Ishmael wandered into the desert again. It was a heartbreaking moment. Hagar, once part of Abraham's household, was now cast out twice, but God was not done with her. In Genesis 21:17-18, when they were near death from thirst, God heard Ishmael's cries and opened Hagar's eyes to a well. She gave her son water and hope, and they survived. Ishmael would go on to become the ancestor of many people, just as God had said. But after this event, Hagar disappears from the narrative, or so it seems. That's where Genesis 25 comes in. When it says Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah, it's curious that the Bible doesn't explain who she is or where she came from. Some early Jewish commentators, like those in the Midrash, specifically Genesis Rabbah 61:4, say that Keturah is actually Hagar restored to Abraham after Sarah's death. The name Keturah is said to come from the Hebrew word for incense, suggesting that her life had become a pleasing offering, one of faithfulness and devotion. It would mean that the servant once cast out was welcomed back and elevated to the role of wife. If that's true, it adds a layer of redemption to Hagar's story that often goes unnoticed. She wasn't forgotten. She wasn't erased. She returned, not just as a survivor, but as a matriarch. Abraham lived 38 years after Sarah's death. Genesis 23 tells us Sarah died at 127 and Abraham died at 175. Genesis 25:7. In that long period between, it's entirely possible that he reunited with Hagar. Perhaps they rekindled a connection forged by their shared past and their shared son, Ishmael. Perhaps the bitterness of old conflicts softened with time, and Abraham saw Hagar not as a servant, but as someone who had carried part of his legacy. This would make Keturah's sons half-brothers to Isaac and Ishmael, and if Keturah is Hagar, it would mean Ishmael grew up with 6 younger siblings. That changes how we view Abraham's family. It wasn't just a triangle of Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham. It may have been much bigger, more complex, and more human. Imagine the possibilities. Ishmael, once sent away, now helping raise his younger brothers. Hagar, once exiled, now head of the tent again. Abraham, once torn by conflict, now finding peace in his final years. If the Bible doesn't give us all these details, it may be because the focus was meant to stay on the covenant with Isaac. But the emotional truth of the story is still present, and the tradition of Keturah as Hagar refuses to go away. Even if they were different women, the placement of Genesis 25 still matters. It doesn't just tie up loose ends. It shows that Abraham had more children, and that these children were part of God's larger plan, even if they weren't part of the central covenant. Genesis 25:6 says, Abraham gave them gifts and sent them away to the east, a direction associated with wisdom and mystery in biblical literature. It's similar to how the wise men came from the east in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 2:1. Maybe these gifts weren't just material things. Maybe they were blessings, teachings, or sacred knowledge. Maybe Abraham knew that God's promise to make him a father of many nations, Genesis 17:4-6, had to go beyond just one line. That promise included Ishmael. It may have included Keturah's sons too. One of them, Midian, became the ancestor of the Midianites, who had a strange relationship with Israel, sometimes enemies, sometimes allies. In Exodus 2, Moses fled to Midian, where he married Zipporah, daughter of the Midianite priest Jethro. Jethro would later advise Moses on leadership in Exodus 18, playing a key role in Israel's journey. Think about that. Moses, the great lawgiver, was shaped partly by a descendant of Keturah. That means Keturah's legacy wasn't lost. It just wasn't named loudly. It traveled quietly through side stories, through alliances, through women and men who weren't always in the spotlight. The silence around her may have been intentional, not to erase, but to protect. In a world where inheritance meant conflict, perhaps naming her too openly would have caused division. Or perhaps the silence is a clue that God's work isn't always in the spotlight. Sometimes it's in the background, growing quietly until the time is right. If Keturah was Hagar, then her story is one of restoration, patience, and promise. If she was someone else, then her story is one of mystery, dignity, and quiet influence. Either way, she mattered. She shaped nations. She raised sons who would shape history, and she remained connected to Abraham in his final years. That alone makes her part of the divine story, whether we read her as Keturah, as Hagar, or as both. Her life reminds us that God doesn't forget anyone. Even those written in the margins are part of the plan. The story of Keturah doesn't end with her quiet introduction in Genesis 25:1-4. In fact, it echoes far beyond her single mention, carried by the lives of her sons, particularly Midian. While we know she bore 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah, the Bible follows very few of them directly, but one name stands out repeatedly throughout the scriptures: Midian. His descendants, the Midianites, would go on to play a surprisingly large role in Israel's future, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as neighbors, and in one very important moment, as spiritual mentors. This tells us something profound. Even though Keturah's name fades after that one verse, the influence of her family never truly left the story. Genesis 25:4 lists Midian's 5 sons: Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abidah, and Eldah. While they too are not deeply explored in the Bible, the people of Midian reappear again and again. For example, in Genesis 37:28, Midianite traders are the ones who take Joseph from his brothers and sell him into slavery in Egypt. This single moment sets off a chain of events that will later define Israel's history. Joseph rises to power in Egypt, rescues his family from famine, and leads to the Israelites living in Egypt for generations before the Exodus. The Midianites were the link between betrayal and destiny. But that wasn't their only interaction with God's people. Fast forward to Exodus 2:15, when Moses flees from Egypt after killing an Egyptian. He finds refuge in the land of Midian and meets the priest Jethro, also called Reuel, who becomes his father-in-law. Moses marries Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, and spends 40 years in Midian tending sheep before returning to lead the Israelites out of bondage. This part of the story is crucial. Moses doesn't just hide in Midian, he learns in Midian. In Exodus 18, after the Exodus has taken place and the Israelites are in the wilderness, Jethro visits Moses. He sees Moses overwhelmed with leading the people and gives him wise counsel on how to delegate authority, telling him to appoint capable men to handle smaller disputes. This advice helps shape the early leadership structure of Israel. Jethro's guidance wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Exodus 18:11 quotes Jethro saying, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods." He even offers sacrifices to God, and Aaron and the elders of Israel share a meal with him. This shows that the descendants of Keturah were not strangers to the God of Abraham. In fact, Jethro's name, Reuel, means friend of God. That's not a coincidence. It points to a deep connection to Abraham's legacy that was never truly broken. Keturah's bloodline, through Midian and Jethro, ends up mentoring the man who would lead God's chosen people. It's an extraordinary reversal. One of Abraham's secondary sons ends up playing a vital role in forming the nation that came through Isaac. This relationship challenges the way we often think about biblical hierarchy. If only Isaac mattered, why did God allow Moses to be formed and shaped by Midianite wisdom? Why was one of the most pivotal leaders in Israel's history married to a woman descended from Abraham's lesser children? And why did that woman's father carry such spiritual authority that he could advise Moses without rebuke? Perhaps the story is telling us something subtle but important, that God's promises to Abraham were bigger than just one line. Remember God's words in Genesis 17:4-6, "You shall be a father of many nations." Not just Israel, many. That promise included Ishmael, Genesis 17:20, and by extension, it may also have included Keturah's sons. The covenant of promise was through Isaac, yes, but the blessings of Abraham spread much wider. That's what we see in the story of Midian. But the Midianites weren't always allies. In Numbers 22-25, they become adversaries when they try to curse Israel through the prophet Balaam and later seduce the Israelites into sin. This led to conflict and eventually war, as told in Numbers 31. This tension makes their role in the story even more complex. They were not simple villains or friends. They were a people with shared ancestry, overlapping history, and spiritual depth. This again points back to Keturah, not as a forgotten figure, but as a foundational one whose children were woven into the fabric of Israel's story. Even if that weaving included both harmony and conflict, it mirrors the experience of siblings, close enough to share heritage, different enough to disagree, and perhaps that's the point. Keturah's children were not part of the covenant through Isaac, but they were not abandoned. They were still part of the story. Their influence continued. Their descendants crossed paths with Israel in meaningful ways. Even in the New Testament, traces of this broader legacy remain. While the text doesn't directly mention Keturah or her sons, the principle that God's promise to Abraham extended to many nations is emphasized in Paul's letters. In Romans 4:17, Paul says that Abraham is the father of us all, speaking spiritually about both Jews and Gentiles. That wide-open vision echoes the promise in Genesis, and if we take it seriously, then the story of Keturah and her sons fits naturally into the unfolding plan. Her role, though quiet in the written record, is loud in the lineage, and her son, Midian, is proof. We can no longer say she was forgotten, only that we forgot to look closely enough. Because when we do, we see her fingerprints all over the path of Israel's formation. From the traders who unknowingly fulfilled prophecy to the priest who mentored a prophet, Keturah's children shaped the journey from promise to people. They were always there, just on the edge of the spotlight, and perhaps that's how God wanted it. Not every foundation is laid in public. Some are buried deep, holding up the structure in silence. Keturah's story reminds us that not all biblical impact comes from loud miracles or grand speeches. Some of it comes from the quiet strength of those who carry legacy without recognition. And when we honor her, we don't just reclaim a woman's name. We reclaim the fuller story of Abraham, the father of many nations, not just one. When we read Genesis 25:2, the list of Keturah's sons may seem like a simple genealogy, but each name, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, represents more than just lineage. These sons, born in Abraham's later years, were sent eastward according to Genesis 25:6, a direction full of mystery and spiritual symbolism in the Bible. Yet if we only see their departure as a dismissal, we miss the subtle and powerful truth of their journey. These weren't mere sons with no role. They were given gifts, a word that suggests intentional blessing, preparation, and perhaps instruction. Abraham, a man known for hearing God's voice, wouldn't have sent them away without purpose. He understood that the promise God gave him, a father of many nations, Genesis 17:4, required more than one path. It's here that the rest of Keturah's children come into focus. Take Jokshan, for example. According to Genesis 25:3, Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. These names reappear in later scriptures, associated with Arabian tribes and wealthy trade centers. Sheba especially is known as a region of great wealth. In 1 Kings 10, the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon, bringing gold, spices, and questions about wisdom. Some scholars trace her lineage back to Jokshan's line, making the connection to Abraham through Keturah. If that's true, then once again, we see how Abraham's so-called secondary children ended up shaping royal encounters and influencing the future of Israel. Dedan too is mentioned in the prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, as part of the Arabian region involved in commerce and caravans. These were not obscure names lost to history. They became nations, traders, and players in the biblical world. The land of Dedan is connected to Edom and is associated with trade in precious stones and goods. This detail supports the idea that Abraham's gifts to these sons may not have been just silver or livestock, but knowledge, economic, spiritual, and practical skills to establish nations. In ancient times, inheritance wasn't only about property, it was about destiny. Abraham, having walked with God for over a century, would have understood how to prepare his children, not only with materials, but with purpose. The sons of Keturah were not heirs to the covenant. That belonged to Isaac, but they were certainly bearers of legacy. Ishbak and Shua, though less mentioned, also carried significance. Shua, in particular, appears in Job 2:11, where Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite come to comfort Job. The name Shuhite connects back to Shua, son of Abraham, and Keturah. While the book of Job is set in an undefined time and place, this connection adds to the idea that Keturah's sons formed recognizable tribes or nations with distinct reputations and wisdom traditions. Job's friends represent regional voices of philosophy and theology, and if one of them came from Shua's line, then that tradition had staying power. Medan, another of Keturah's sons, may also have contributed to tribes in the Arabian Peninsula or regions near Midian. Though not much is directly said about Medan, the pattern across all 6 sons is consistent. They go east, they settle, and their descendants appear throughout Scripture, often in pivotal moments. This recurring presence implies that these children formed a parallel network of nations, related by blood to Israel, but living just outside the main narrative. It's important to remember that the ancient world operated by family ties. Treaties, alliances, and even wars were often between kin. The fact that the descendants of Keturah appear in both friendly and hostile interactions with Israel doesn't mean they were insignificant. It means they mattered deeply. They were part of the world God was shaping through Abraham's legacy, even if they weren't the focus of the covenant. That too tells us something important, that God's work often happens on multiple levels at once. While Isaac was the son of promise, Keturah's sons were the sons of expansion. Isaac received the covenant blessing, the line that would become Israel, but Keturah's sons received something else: territory, trade, and time. They were dispersed not to be forgotten, but to fulfill another part of God's promise, that Abraham's seed would be as numerous as the stars, Genesis 15:5, and that he would be a blessing to all nations, Genesis 12:3. Perhaps the sons of Keturah helped prepare the world for Israel by becoming nations of their own. Perhaps they built roads, created trade routes, and formed spiritual traditions that would later intersect with God's people. When we think of the wise men who visited Jesus in Matthew 2, we don't know exactly where they came from, only that they came from the east. Could it be that they were the spiritual descendants of Abraham through one of Keturah's sons? Could their journey to find the Messiah have roots in the legacy that Abraham sent eastward generations before? It's not a stretch. The East, biblically, has always been a place of both mystery and origin. Eden was planted in the East, Genesis 2:8. When Cain was cast out, he went east of Eden, Genesis 4:16. When the Tower of Babel's builders migrated, they went east, Genesis 11:2. It is a direction loaded with symbolism of exile, of seeking, of destiny, and it is where Abraham's sons by Keturah were sent. That cannot be accidental. Abraham understood direction. He followed God's call from Ur to Canaan. He built altars and walked the land of promise. So when he sent these sons east, it was not random. It was prophetic. He was scattering seeds. The Bible doesn't give us long narratives about Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Ishbak, and Shuah. But the fragments it does give, tribes, trade, names, wisdom, form a pattern. It's a pattern of divine intentionality. These sons were not a footnote. They were a foundation. Keturah's motherhood is not just biological. It is historical. Her children formed the highways between Abraham's past and Israel's future. And the gifts Abraham gave them, they may have looked small, but in the hands of those sons, they built worlds. In a way, Keturah's story is the story of everything we don't see in the Bible's spotlight. The trade, the treaties, the ideas, the relationships that support the main story, but are never the main characters. And that's what makes her legacy powerful, because not every pillar needs to be named to hold up a temple. What makes Keturah's story so powerful is not just her children or the tribes they became, but how her silence echoes a theme that runs through the entire Bible, how God often works through the forgotten, the unnamed, and the seemingly unimportant. Her quiet presence in Abraham's later years mirrors a deeper truth, that the most pivotal players in the divine narrative are often the ones least recognized. Keturah may not speak in the Bible, but her legacy speaks volumes through the lives of others, like her, women and people who existed on the edge of the text, but were central to its unfolding. Consider Tamar in Genesis 38. She is a widow, left alone when her husbands die, and denied justice by Judah. But instead of fading into the margins, she secures her place in Israel's lineage through boldness and strategy. She gives birth to twins, Perez and Zerah, and Perez becomes an ancestor of King David and ultimately Jesus, Matthew 1:3. Tamar's actions were not praised in her time, but God saw them and included her in his redemptive plan. Her story, like Keturah's, reminds us that even when people try to control legacy and lineage, God writes the final version. Then there's Rahab in Joshua 2, a Canaanite prostitute living in the walls of Jericho. She should have been erased when Israel conquered the city, but she wasn't. She hid the Israelite spies, declared faith in the God of Israel, and was saved along with her family. Her faith became her legacy, and she too appears in the genealogy of Jesus, Matthew 1:5. Rahab, like Keturah, came from outside the central story. She was not a descendant of Abraham through Isaac, but through her belief and bravery, she became part of the promise. Zipporah, the Midianite wife of Moses, is another echo of Keturah's legacy. In Exodus 2, when Moses flees Egypt, it's Zipporah's father, Jethro, descendant of Midian, son of Keturah, who welcomes him. Zipporah marries Moses and becomes the mother of his sons. In Exodus 4:24-26, there's a strange and haunting episode. God seeks to kill Moses, but Zipporah circumcises their son and touches Moses with the blood, and God lets him go. It's one of the most cryptic moments in the Torah, but it shows that Zipporah understood covenant, understood action, and knew what was required in a divine moment. Like Keturah, her understanding came not from the spotlight, but from the margins, from years of tradition and wisdom passed quietly down her line. These women weren't born into covenant. They entered it through faith, through action, and through courage. And in that way, they follow the same thread as Keturah. Her silence in the text is not a sign of irrelevance. It's a reflection of a pattern. God using the unseen to uphold the seen, using the outsiders to reinforce the center. In a world that valued birth order and male inheritance, these women altered history with almost no words at all. Even in the New Testament, this pattern continues. In Luke 2:36-38, we meet Anna the prophetess, a widow who served God with fasting and prayer in the temple. She speaks only briefly, yet is the first woman to publicly proclaim the Messiah after his birth. She, like Keturah, waited patiently, acted faithfully, and was given a place in sacred memory, not because of her role in power, but because of her role in promise. The Bible, when read closely, is not a book that silences women. It's a book that reveals how often their voices were ignored by society, but not by God. It's no coincidence that Jesus first appeared after his resurrection to Mary Magdalene, not Peter or John. It's not a mistake that women were the first to proclaim the risen Christ, even if the men didn't believe them. In these patterns, we find a divine logic that overturns human hierarchies. And Keturah, though only briefly named, fits into this logic perfectly. She mothered nations. She shaped history through her sons. And her wisdom lives on in descendants like Jethro, Zipporah, and perhaps even the Queen of Sheba. Her influence is quiet but permanent. In Proverbs 31:10-31, the ideal woman is described not by how loudly she speaks, but by how deeply she impacts. She rises early, manages her home, speaks wisdom, and her children rise up and call her blessed. Keturah may be one of those women. We never see her speak, but her children, Midian, Jokshan, Shua, speak for her. Their lives, their tribes, and their intersection with the story of Israel serve as her voice, and perhaps that is the lesson she leaves us with, that spiritual legacy is not always measured in words or visibility, but in the fruit that grows long after the seed is sown. Abraham's covenant was through Isaac, but his impact was through many. And Keturah, unseen and often unnamed, helped fulfill God's word that Abraham would be a father of many nations. Not all of those nations needed to be in the spotlight to matter. Some, like the Midianites who shaped Moses, or the people of Sheba who tested Solomon's wisdom, or the Shuhites who debated with Job, played their role without needing full chapters of scripture. They were present, they mattered, and behind them stood Keturah. In our search for the dramatic and the dominant, we often miss the sustaining presence of those who hold the structure together. Keturah did not need applause to be important. Her life challenges us to rethink value, not in terms of noise or notoriety, but in legacy, lineage, and the quiet power of obedience. She reminds us that God writes history not only through kings and prophets, but through mothers, mentors, and matriarchs whose names appear once and still change everything. If the Bible gives us only a whisper of Keturah, then that whisper carries the weight of nations. The question of Keturah's true identity has stirred debate for centuries, and what may seem like a passing mention in Genesis 25:1, then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah, has sparked one of the oldest and most controversial interpretations in Jewish tradition, that Keturah was actually Hagar, Abraham's former concubine and the mother of Ishmael. This view is not universally accepted, but it appears in major rabbinic texts, like Genesis Rabbah 61:4, where the sages say, Keturah is Hagar. Why was she called Keturah? Because her deeds were as beautiful as incense, Ketoret, and because she remained chaste after separating from Abraham. In other words, her new name wasn't an attempt to hide her identity, but to signify her spiritual return, her restored dignity, and her enduring connection to Abraham even after years of exile. This interpretation adds profound emotional and theological depth to the story. Hagar, after being cast out in Genesis 21, having wandered in the wilderness with her dying son, became a symbol of rejection and survival. God met her at her lowest point, calling her by name and opening her eyes to a well of water. Genesis 21:19. It was the first time in Scripture that God addressed a woman directly, and even more notably, it was the first time a person in the Bible named God. She called him El Roy, the God who sees me. Genesis 16:13. If Keturah is indeed Hagar, then her story is one of restoration unlike any other. Cast out by Abraham under Sarah's demand, then seen by God in the desert, and finally brought back as wife, not just concubine, her return marks a cycle of divine redemption, and it reframes Abraham's story not as one of replacement, but reconciliation. This interpretation may not be found directly in the canonical narrative, but the clues are there. Genesis 25:6 says that Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them eastward away from Isaac. While Hagar and Keturah are listed separately in different verses, the term concubines, in the plural form, has led many scholars to speculate whether it refers to Hagar and Keturah as the same person, both concubine and wife, rejected and restored. In this way, Abraham's final years reflect a quiet mending of broken ties. The rabbinic emphasis on the name Keturah also points to intentionality. The name itself, derived from the Hebrew root ketoret, incense, symbolizes purity and devotion. According to this interpretation, Keturah's incense-like faithfulness, after years apart from Abraham, elevated her status in God's eyes. It wasn't merely that she was brought back, it was that she had never truly left the covenant. The incense, offered daily in the temple by priests, symbolized prayers rising to God. By naming her Keturah, tradition suggests that her life, silent, chaste, and faithful, was itself a kind of offering. If we accept that Hagar and Keturah are the same woman, then her journey becomes one of the most powerful testimonies of mercy, patience, and hope in all of Scripture. She begins as a servant girl from Egypt, brought into Abraham's house by Sarah. Genesis 16:1. She becomes pregnant, flees, is met by an angel, returns, and is later exiled again. She nearly dies, watches her son cry in thirst, and yet is seen and saved. She vanishes from the story, only to reappear decades later, perhaps under a new name, a new role, and a healed relationship. This is not merely a love story, it is a divine reversal. It shows that God not only redeems, but also rewrites. It also reframes Ishmael's place in the story. Often treated as the rejected son, Ishmael too receives promises from God. In Genesis 17:20, God says, "I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." These 12 rulers echo the 12 tribes of Israel, showing that God's promises to Abraham were not confined to one line. If Hagar returned as Keturah and her sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah, were born afterward, then the family tapestry becomes one of inclusion, not exclusion. In early Christian writings, the church fathers debated this theory. Some rejected the idea that Keturah and Hagar were the same woman, choosing instead to highlight Keturah as a separate symbol of Abraham's continued fruitfulness and God's blessing into his old age. Others, like St. Jerome, mentioned the theory while favoring a literal distinction between the two women. But even when divided on the identity, most agreed on the theme, that Abraham's story after Sarah was not barren, but full. His life did not end with the covenant, it extended into legacy. What makes this debate so rich is that it touches not just on names, but on how we read the Bible itself. Is the story linear, clear-cut, and final? Or is it layered, full of echoes, symbols, and deliberate gaps that invite us to look closer? The Keturah-Hagar theory isn't about proving a name. It's about uncovering a truth, that the people written out of the center are often still part of the story's soul. If Keturah was Hagar, then her return becomes a symbol of healing, not just between individuals, but between God's justice and his mercy, between exile and homecoming, between what was lost and what was found again. Her sons, sent east, become part of the world that will eventually intersect with Israel again and again. The sons of Isaac will meet the sons of Keturah in tents, in trade routes, in battlefields, and around sacred fires. Their shared bloodline, though complicated, binds them in a destiny neither side could erase, and all of it begins with one woman, once cast out, perhaps renamed, but never forgotten. Whether or not we accept the theory that Keturah and Hagar are the same woman, the fact that this debate even exists is a sign of her importance. The scribes, the sages, the scholars, they did not ignore her. They wondered about her. They questioned, wrestled, and recorded her in their sacred texts. That tells us everything. Keturah was not a filler in Abraham's twilight years. She was a mystery planted by God, a gap left open not by accident, but by design. And when a name causes generations to ask, who was she really? Then that name has power. While Keturah's presence in the text of Genesis may seem brief, the geographical and historical footprints of her children stretch far beyond the few verses that mention their names. To truly understand the breadth of her legacy, we must turn to archaeology, ancient tribal records, and biblical geography, because the names of her sons are not simply genealogical placeholders, they're markers of ancient peoples, regions, and networks that reached across the Arabian Peninsula and into the pages of Israel's history, time and time again. Genesis 25:3-4 names the sons of Keturah and then the sons of her son Midian, creating a chain of lineage that many believe traces directly into what we now call the Midianites. These people appear throughout the Hebrew Bible, not as a lost tribe, but as a powerful, organized, and culturally influential group that interacted with Israel from Moses all the way to the Judges. Archaeological discoveries in northwestern Arabia and the Sinai Peninsula have uncovered traces of Midianite settlements, pottery, and trade routes dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE. Midianite pottery, identified by its unique red and black patterns, has been found in Timnah and other locations near ancient copper mines, showing that the descendants of Keturah were not only survivors, but builders, traders, and organizers of sophisticated communities. The Bible itself gives us glimpses into their complexity. In Exodus 2, Moses flees Egypt and finds refuge among the Midianites. He marries Zipporah, daughter of Jethro, a Midianite priest. Jethro, in Exodus 18, later advises Moses on how to govern the people, suggesting a judicial system of delegated authority that Moses adopts, a clear indication that the Midianites were not primitive wanderers, but possessed their own traditions of wisdom and order. Jethro's title, Priest of Midian, suggests a structured religious role and his knowledge of the one true God, long before the giving of the law at Sinai, hints at a preserved spiritual tradition from Abraham's household, possibly passed down through Keturah's line. In Numbers 10:29, Hobab, another Midianite relative of Moses, is described as a guide who knows the wilderness terrain, showing how Israel relied on these eastern kin not just for advice, but for survival. The Midianites reappear in Judges 6-8 as antagonists during the time of Gideon. Yet even here the narrative is layered. While they are described as oppressors, their strength is a reflection of how large and organized their community had become. They traveled with camels as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Judges 7:12, suggesting a nomadic empire of great size and power. They were not simple raiders. They were descendants of Abraham, distant cousins of Israel, whose strength had grown parallel to God's chosen people. In fact, the very term east used in Genesis 25:6 to describe where Abraham sent Keturah's sons may refer to the Arabian Peninsula as a whole. And that's where the geography deepens. Scholars have connected names like Sheba, Dedan, and Midian to regions in modern-day Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. Sheba, for example, was likely a wealthy kingdom in southwestern Arabia, known for its spices and gold. Dedan was located near modern-day Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia, an ancient oasis that served as a trading hub on the incense route. These connections aren't just speculation. Inscriptions, trade records, and archaeological digs support the presence of powerful ancient kingdoms tied to these biblical names. Even the famous Queen of Sheba, who visited Solomon in 1 Kings 10, is believed to have come from this region, possibly a descendant of Keturah through Jokshan. Her visit was more than ceremonial. It represented a diplomatic and theological meeting of two worlds rooted in the same spiritual ancestry. The gifts she brought, gold, spices, and precious stones, match the trade goods associated with the Arabian kingdoms tied to Keturah's lineage. Moreover, Ezekiel 27 mentions Sheba and Dedan as merchants trading with Tyre, the great Phoenician city. This shows that Keturah's descendants were not only present in the region, but active in global commerce. They moved along the Red Sea coastlines, connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, and built cities that lasted for centuries. The ancient world was held together not just by kings and warriors, but by traders and builders, and Keturah's children were among them. This is important because it reframes how we understand God's blessing to Abraham in Genesis 12:2-3, when God promises to make him a great nation and that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. While this is often seen through the narrow lens of Isaac and Israel, Keturah's descendants remind us that Abraham's impact extended far beyond the covenant line. Through Keturah's sons, the infrastructure of ancient civilization, the roads, the trade, the exchange of wisdom, was shaped by those who bore his blood. These were not sideline tribes. They were part of God's wider plan, and though they didn't receive the covenant, they were part of the blessing. Modern researchers have even traced some Arabian genealogies that remember a connection to Abraham. Islamic tradition, for example, holds that many Arabian tribes, including those descended from Ishmael, trace their roots to Abraham. While Keturah's sons are less emphasized in Islamic literature, some genealogical overlap suggests a shared memory of Abraham's Eastern lineage. That cultural continuity reinforces what Genesis hints at, that Abraham's children went on to shape multiple civilizations, not just one. In this way, Keturah's legacy becomes a bridge. She stands at the junction where biblical history meets global heritage. Her sons didn't build temples or receive tablets, but they built trade networks, founded cities, and raised families that would touch the world. And this influence isn't just a footnote, it's foundational. The fact that Scripture lists her sons and grandsons by name, Genesis 25, 2-4, is rare and intentional. The Bible is usually brief in its genealogies unless the names matter, and in Keturah's case, they matter immensely. They're part of a forgotten map of God's design, a web of peoples and paths that link Israel to the world. When we look at how the descendants of Isaac interacted with the nations of Midian, Sheba, Dedan, and others, we find tension, cooperation, and prophecy, and all of it loops back to Abraham's final wife, who bore the children he would send east, not in rejection, but in preparation. These sons may have been given gifts instead of the covenant, but those gifts turned into kingdoms. And in those kingdoms, we find echoes of Abraham's faith, Keturah's legacy, and a God who works in every direction. One of the most overlooked verses in all of Genesis may hold the greatest insight into Keturah's significance. Genesis 25:6 says, "But unto the sons of the concubines, which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts, and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country." It's easy to skim past that line, but it tells us something profound. Abraham did not disown the sons of Keturah. He gave them gifts. He didn't cast them out in anger. He sent them eastward with intention while he was still alive. In the ancient world, gift-giving was a sign of blessing, not rejection. It marked inheritance, not of the covenant, which was given to Isaac, but of opportunity, resources, and legacy. Abraham knew what he was doing. He was shaping futures. The East, in biblical symbolism, often represents the unknown, the place of origin, and the place of dispersion. Eden lay eastward, Genesis 2:8. Cain was sent east after killing Abel, Genesis 4:16. The Tower of Babel scattered humanity toward the east, and now Abraham sends Keturah's sons east, not to be forgotten, but to plant something new. The gifts he gave them weren't simply material, they were catalytic. They were the seeds of nations. They were knowledge, wisdom, skill, and perhaps a form of spiritual inheritance passed down from the patriarch himself. The Bible doesn't detail these gifts, but their later history shows they took root. Their names appear in tribal records, trade alliances, and spiritual moments that show they carried the imprint of Abrahamic influence. This act of eastward sending reflects a larger biblical theme. Inheritance doesn't always follow the expected path. Jacob, the younger son, inherits the blessing over Esau. Manasseh, the older son of Joseph, is bypassed when Jacob blesses Ephraim instead, Genesis 48:14. The Levites, unlike the other tribes, receive no land inheritance, but they are given the priesthood. Time and again, God honors the spiritual over the structural. And, in Abraham's case, while Isaac carries the covenant, Keturah's sons carry the influence. This dual stream, one of promise and one of expansion, becomes a hallmark of how God works. He preserves his covenant with Israel but still allows his blessing to move through unexpected channels. The eastward expansion of Keturah's sons echoes the parable of the sower in the New Testament. Some seed falls on rocky ground, some among thorns, and some on good soil. The seed is the word, but but the soil determines how it grows. Keturah's sons, sent east with gifts, represent seed planted in distant lands, and from them, civilizations grew. This is how God operates, not just through temples and covenants, but through movement, migration, and multiplication. The eastward journey also mirrors later biblical themes of dispersion and gathering. Israel will be scattered to the nations, and one day gathered again. Jesus speaks of gathering his people from the east and the west, from the north and the south. Luke 13:29. Revelation 7:2 speaks of an angel ascending from the east to seal God's servants. There is power in that direction, not as rejection, but as reach. Keturah's children were not cast out. They were sent forth. They were extended influence, and that's a key distinction. They were not hidden in shame, but planted in purpose. In this way, Keturah's story becomes a counterpoint to Sarah's. Sarah gave birth to the covenant, but Keturah gave birth to legacy. One was the chosen vessel, the other the multiplier, and both were necessary. Without Sarah, there is no Isaac, no Israel. But without Keturah, there is no Moses' sanctuary in Midian, no wisdom of Jethro, no crossroads of Sheba and Dedan, no trade connecting the nations to God's people. Abraham's family becomes the model for how God can work within structure and beyond it, through the central line and also through the branches that stretch into the world. The gifts given to Keturah's sons also hint at the ancient tradition of oral and spiritual knowledge being passed generationally. Abraham wasn't just a shepherd, he was a teacher, a prophet, a covenant bearer. His knowledge of the stars, the seasons, the promises of God, all of this could have been part of the gifts. Just as he taught Isaac how to build altars, how to recognize the voice of God, he may have taught the sons of Keturah how to lead, how to live, and how to shape their own peoples with wisdom. And if this is true, then the influence of Abraham didn't stop with Isaac. It flowed east into regions that would later interact with Israel in critical moments. These sons, though not chosen for the covenant, were chosen for purpose. And Keturah, their mother, becomes the quiet vessel of that purpose. It's also worth noticing that the Bible never condemns Abraham for marrying Keturah. In fact, her appearance after Sarah's death shows a man still committed to life, to building, and to family. He doesn't retreat into isolation. He multiplies. And in that, he mirrors God's original command to humanity in Genesis 1:28, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth." Keturah becomes the fulfillment of that call, not just through physical children, but through the scattering of wisdom, tradition, and connection. The East then becomes not a place of exile, but a place of extension. It becomes the other half of the Abrahamic mission, to bless all nations. And through Keturah, that blessing becomes mobile. Her children become bridges, connecting the covenant people with the outer world, reminding us that God's work is not confined to one camp, one tabernacle, or one tribe. It moves outward. And in every tent, on every trail, someone carries the spark that began with Abraham, and perhaps was fanned into flame by Keturah. In the Bible, silence is rarely emptiness. It is space for reflection, mystery, and depth. The silence around Keturah is not accidental. It's an invitation to see how a woman with few words can have immense impact. Her sons didn't return to Isaac's camp, but their legacy did. They met Israel in the desert, in the temple courts, in the trade routes, and in prophetic dreams, and all of it began with a woman given no speech but trusted with nations. As we draw closer to the conclusion of Keturah's story, we find her legacy reaching beyond the Old Testament into the New Testament's powerful message of inclusion and spiritual inheritance. The Apostle Paul, in his letters to the Galatians and Romans, reshapes the understanding of God's promises, not as confined to physical lineage, but extended to faith and grace. In Galatians 3:29, Paul declares, "If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. This radical statement opens the door for those outside Isaac's line, like Keturah's sons, Ishmael, and even Gentiles, to be part of God's family through faith. Paul's teaching suggests that God's covenant with Abraham was never meant to be limited by birth alone. Rather, it was always about spiritual inheritance. This connects beautifully with the mystery of Keturah. Though her children were sent eastward and given gifts instead of the covenant, they still carry Abraham's bloodline, a lineage that Paul says can be embraced by anyone who believes. It's a theme of widening circles and breaking down walls. The New Testament message is that no one is truly excluded from God's promise, whether because of birth, nationality, or past. And Keturah's story, often overshadowed, becomes a precursor to this gospel truth. Her legacy reminds us that God's blessing is multifaceted. It's not confined to one family or tribe, but extends across nations, peoples, and hearts. It also reveals the patience and grace in God's plan, working not just through the chosen line, but through the many branches that grow from Abraham's root. Moreover, Keturah's place in this unfolding story challenges us to reconsider who counts in God's kingdom. In Romans 4, Paul points to Abraham's faith being credited to him as righteousness. Before the covenant was sealed with circumcision, faith, not lineage, was the foundation. This opens a space for Keturah and her children who may have lacked the formal covenant but carried Abraham's faith and blessing to be part of the spiritual family. We see this inclusion echoed in the New Testament stories of women, outsiders, and former enemies becoming part of God's people. Consider Rahab, a Canaanite woman who sheltered Israelite spies and was counted righteous by faith. Hebrews 11:31. Or the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4, whose encounter with Jesus breaks cultural barriers and offers living water to a marginalized community. Their stories resonate with the idea that God's family is not limited by birth or tradition, but expanded by grace and faith. Keturah's story fits into this broader biblical narrative of inclusion. She is part of the unseen foundation upon which God's diverse family is built. The fact that her sons interacted with Israel, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in cooperation, reflects the ongoing tension and integration between chosen and other nations. It reminds us that the sacred story is messy, complex, and inclusive, and in that complexity lies the beauty of God's plan. For believers today, Keturah's story speaks directly to questions of identity, inheritance, and belonging. In a world often divided by ethnicity, culture, and religion, the message that God's promise flows beyond physical bloodlines offers hope. It invites us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a vast, interconnected family. It calls us to embrace those who seem other and to find God's blessing in unexpected places. Keturah's legacy, though hidden, challenges exclusivity and calls for expansion. It tells us that the story of faith is not a straight line, but a web, woven with many threads, many voices, many unseen women and men who carry God's blessing quietly but powerfully. This is the heart of her prophecy, that no one is truly forgotten in God's plan, and that the unseen often hold the keys to the greatest transformations. Her story reminds us to look beyond the obvious, to listen to the silent, and to honor the legacies that don't always appear in the spotlight, but are no less sacred. In embracing Keturah's place in the story, we embrace a fuller, richer vision of God's work in the world. And that vision is one of inclusion, grace, and hope for all nations. As we come to the close of this journey through the unseen chapters of Abraham's life, we are left with a profound truth that history is not made only by those whose names are loudly proclaimed, but often by those whose stories are whispered, veiled, or simply overlooked. Keturah, the wife whose name appears briefly in Genesis 25, reminds us that God's plan is wider, deeper, and more inclusive than our narrow lineages and traditions allow. Her presence in Abraham's story, though quiet, reshapes how we understand covenant, inheritance, and blessing. It teaches us that God's promises are not limited to a single family or a single son, but flow out into the nations, sometimes through paths we least expect. Her sons, who spread eastward with gifts from Abraham, were not forgotten. They carried Abraham's legacy into lands that would later intersect with Israel's destiny in surprising ways. Through Midian, through Sheba, through Dedan, and beyond, the ripple effect of her motherhood touched the pages of history. And as we've seen, the idea that Keturah might be Hagar returned transforms her story into one of restoration and grace, a testament to God's mercy in healing broken relationships and renewing promises. This healing echoes throughout Scripture, reminding us that God sees the unseen, remembers the forgotten, and redeems the cast aside. It connects with the New Testament's message that faith, not birthright alone, determines who belongs to God's family. Paul's words in Galatians and Romans widen the circle, inviting us all into the promise Abraham received by faith. Keturah's story, with its gaps and mysteries, invites us into that larger story, a story of inclusion, reconciliation, and hope. As believers today, her legacy challenges us to rethink identity, to look beyond bloodlines and traditions to the heart of faith, to honor those who have labored in silence, and to remember that God's work often happens behind the scenes through unexpected people and places. Her story is a call to embrace the diversity within God's family and to recognize the sacred in those we might otherwise overlook. In a world too often divided by heritage, culture, and history, Keturah's example offers a bridge. She teaches us that blessings come in many forms and that God's promises are fulfilled through all kinds of vessels, seen and unseen. Her life reminds us that every voice matters in the divine symphony, even those spoken only once or twice in ancient texts. And as we carry her story forward, we join in a long tradition of uncovering the hidden and celebrating the quiet. May her legacy inspire us to seek the unseen, to value the overlooked, and to trust that God's hand moves in every story, no matter how softly it is told. Abraham's covenant was great, but Keturah's story is greater still. It is the story of faith extended, of grace restored, and of a promise that no one, not even the unseen wife, can ever erase.